Uh, Welcome, first of all. I'm really happy to be here, and I'd like to thank first my good friends Antti and Elina for inviting me here. Therefore, I'm grateful to Kalevi Sorsa Foundation and Finnish Society for Political Economy Research, if I'm not wrong, and if I spelled that correct, if I remember that correctly. As Elina mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about economics in crisis. And Elina briefly mentioned about the story, but I'll just slightly talk about the background to all this. The student protest against the teaching of economics has been going on since the 1970s. This is not something new. This is not something that's just been happening after the credit crunch. I mean, you can trace back the student protests about the teaching of economics all the way back to 1970s, actually. But of course, these protests spark up and then they die, and then with the new generation, they spark up again, and then they die again. So this is not really something new. And once again, University of Manchester students, actually my students, are not really the first ones to revolt against the teaching of economics. The actual protest first started in France, as most of you would remember, with the post-statistic economics recently in 2000. And then after the credit crunch, once again, French students protested the economics teaching that they were receiving, and organized under the name PEP's Economy in 2009. And then it was the students at the University of Tübingen. I'm going to talk about these in my speech briefly, but I just want to give a quick background. And the University of Tübingen students actually, once again, were very unhappy with the economics teaching that they're receiving. So they organized a reading group, and then it spread to Europe. But then what the Manchester students managed to do was really to bring the discussion into a global sphere, simply because they managed to get quite a bit of publicity and media attention. And they appeared in newspapers like The Independent, The Guardian. And what happened was I was lecturing the mainstream macroeconomics module at Manchester when my students revolted. And they said they're fed up with this, in their words, nonsense, actually, that they're learning. And I was the lecturer. And I told them that I share most of their thoughts, that I agree with most of what they're saying. And they asked me if I could teach them something different, actually, something heterodox. And I said, I'll happily do this. And I prepared a course outline, which consisted mostly of heterodox economics, some economic history of financial crisis, Great Depression, Asian crisis, Nordic crisis, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, in the 1990s, and some heterodox economics like post-Keynesians, Austrians, Marxists, circuit theory, everything just bundled inside in one module. And I proposed this as an official module to run at the University of Manchester, which was rejected. And then, of course, my students were very unhappy with this, so they started campaigning and bringing the media attention to the topic, actually. So at some point, we started appearing on newspapers almost every week, one after the other. And then last year, basically this year, in February, I proposed the module once again at the University of Manchester. And ironically, my course outline included articles from Dr. Honkapoya himself as well. And the module was rejected for a second time, despite all the media attention and all the hype. And my students collected 250 signatures from economics students for my module to run, and me to stay, really, because my contract was expiring. And the university did not listen to any of these complaints and ended my contract at the end. Basically, did not renew my contract, really. So I'm not exactly sacked. I want to make this clear. My contract was expiring. It wasn't renewed, despite all the pressure that was going on. So that's the context, actually. So my students are still struggling in Manchester. I occasionally go and see them in Manchester, see how they're doing. But the battle is actually still going on in Manchester. And some of you might have heard the economics students last year told the department that unless they get what they want, they will give really bad marks in the National Student Survey. and they kept their promise. The National Student Survey for the Economics Department at Manchester dropped by 21% this year. This is the news of the last month, really. The NSS results came out. There was a piece in the Guardian, in the Times Higher Education about this a few weeks ago, simply because they were pretty crowded, actually. My students, it's not just a few of them. We're talking about about 100 students, maybe. And of course, their votes brought the NSS results down, and as I've said, the battle is still going on. So I'd like to start my presentation with one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite books, I would say. It's from the book by Mark Buchanan, a physicist and actually the former editor of Nature, actually the science journal Nature, from his book Forecast: What Physics, Meteorology and Natural Sciences Can Teach Us About Economics, where he accuses the economists that if they wish to study the horse, they wouldn't just go and look at the horses, they'd sit in their studies and imagine what they would do if they were a horse, really. This more or less sums up the way mainstream economics actually conduct research, in my opinion. It's shared by Mark Buchanan as well, and quite a lot of heterodox economists. Sorry? No, he's a physicist. Sorry. The talk I'm going to give today draws from a recent paper. Well, it's a commentary, really. It's not a paper. A recent commentary we wrote with Professor Engelbert Stockhammer to the journal Radical Philosophy. It's going to be forthcoming in the following couple of months, I hope, when they edit our commentary and they're happy with it. So I just wanted to make sure about this. And then I'm going to briefly talk about what is mainstream economics and why are the students actually unhappy. What is this thing that we call mainstream economics all the time? And what distinguishes mainstream from heterodox? This is a very broad topic, by the way. I'm not going to claim that I know the answers to this question. I'm just going to reflect my own opinions and some other heterodox thinkers' opinions about this. It's quite difficult to talk about this topic because obviously the boundaries are not so clear sometimes. And then I'm going to talk about a brief history of the student movement and mainstream's response. I've personally engaged in quite a few discussions with some mainstream economists who were willing to engage in this discussion on their blogs, on blogospheres actually. But apart from that, and some mainstream economists actually bothered to take these complaints seriously and at least to write a response to these complaints. Just a few though, not much. Still, there's not too much response from the mainstream, simply because they're in their ivory towers, actually, and thinking that these are just a bunch of students who don't really know anything anyway. That's more or less the approach that they have. That's the reaction that one gets. Luckily, since I got my PhD in mainstream economics myself, I am immune to this sort of defense, because I've written a fully mainstream PhD, and I've published all my chapters as well in mainstream journals. So I can confidently say when I'm talking about the mainstream, I know what I'm talking about, actually. And then I'm going to provide a brief critical assessment of the student movement, where it should go, where it could go, and what should be done, really. Oops, sorry. Now, mainstream economics, this is sometimes called the neoclassical economics as well, but let me tell you that most economists are quite unhappy to be called neoclassical economists. This is kind of an insult, actually. If you call someone a neoclassical economist, they'll always deny this and say, no, I'm not a neoclassical economist. My work is different from neoclassical economics. But I'm gonna talk, when I'm talking about mainstream economics, I'm gonna use these terms interchangeably, because I'm gonna talk about a few common set of principles that all mainstream or neoclassical economics uses, actually. And as I've said, one can identify mainstream economics or neoclassical economics from the distinct methodological approach that it employs when it's trying to analyze economic phenomena. And one of the basic premises of mainstream economics is always to start from the individual agent or the firm, actually. And then the models will investigate individuals' decisions on consumption, saving, labor supply. In general, the models will incorporate a representative agent, assuming that there is a single person in the economy, actually, and there's a single firm. Or, in some models, there will be a continuum of identical consumers or identical firms, which mathematically ends up with the same results, really. So it's not really many agents, it's many identical agents, which is almost equal to assuming one agent, really. It gives exactly the same results mathematically, at least. On the other hand, the firm takes decisions on investment, wages, and labor demand. And then these approaches are actually, and then the models apply a bottom-up approach. Either individuals and the firm's decisions are aggregated. If there's a continuum of individuals and firms, they are added up simply to arrive at the macro conclusion. Or, particularly after the developments in the general equilibrium theory, which proved that it's not that easy to add up people's choices. Or in other words, there's a famous Sonnenheim-Mantel-Dobrot theorem, which says that even if individual demand curves might be downward sloping, for example, if you add up individuals' demand curves, the market demand curve may not be downward sloping, actually. Or in other words, for one individual, when price falls, you might demand more of a good because it's cheaper. But you cannot add up hundreds of people and argue that the market demand is also exactly like this, that when the price of a good falls, the market demand increases as well. This was proven by the mainstream economists themselves, actually, that you cannot do this. And mostly after this, the model started using instead a representative individual or a firm, because that actually, at least in theory, solves the problem of adding up, because you've got only one individual this time, so you don't have to add up, really. And basically, this approach has been identified as methodological individualism by Varoufakis, a Greek economist, a game theoretician, actually, and a philosopher at the same time. He's got a very good paper called Neoclassical Economics, A Most Peculiar Failure, actually. And there he identifies this approach as methodological individualism, and it's in its strictest form. This approach argues that all explanations should be synthesized from separate, autonomous, and prior explanations at the level of the individual. So in other words, when you're analyzing the society, you should start from the individual. And therefore, a strict explanatory separation of structure from agency is imposed here. And the analytical trajectory moves unidirectionally from full explanations of agency to derived theories of structure. This might sound slightly philosophical, but what it's saying is that you start from the individual, actually, and the causality moves unidirectionally from the individual to the society, rather than a bidirectional relationship between the two. And of course, different versions of mainstream have evolved over time. Mainstream is not, that's one of the reasons that it's quite difficult to collect them under one umbrella, really, because at different points in time, there have been different versions of mainstream, really. At some point, monetarism of Friedman was the mainstream, and you might remember the famous Thatcher years in the UK as well. This is just a pure implementation of Friedman's monetarism, really. Oops, I'm sorry. And then after that, in the 1980s particularly, there was the real business cycle theory, which actually argued that unemployment in a capitalist economy is purely voluntary. It's because people just choose leisure over work. Now, this might sound completely ridiculous, and it is actually completely ridiculous, unfortunately. But there was a point that the real business cycle theory was the mainstream, arguing in this direction. And from this evolved the new Keynesian macroeconomics. This is the mainstream at the moment, actually. It's the models are the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. But please don't be fooled by the name dynamic. There's nothing dynamic in the models, really. The models are just calculating one equilibrium, giving a shock to the economy, calculating the other equilibrium, and then connecting the two equilibriums. That's what you're doing, technically. So although the name sounds dynamic, it's not really dynamic. There's nothing dynamic there. And here, there is involuntary unemployment in the SGE model, simply because, of course, the the clever mainstream economists knew that arguing that all unemployment is voluntary does not make any sort of sense. So in the SGE models, there is involuntary unemployment, but the reason that involuntary unemployment arises is because wages are rigid, or in other words, wages don't adjust, particularly downwards. Meaning that since wages do not fall in the crisis enough, we get unemployment. If the wages had fallen enough, we wouldn't get unemployment, actually. This is the argument. Or in some models, you've got asymmetric information. The involuntary unemployment arises because agents have got asymmetric information. One agent has got some information that the other does not have, actually, and that's what's leading to mismatch in the labor markets. And in the latest models, particularly after the crisis, the new generation DSGE models have got search and matching imperfections, which argue that unemployment arises because there's search and matching imperfections. If we can actually match the employees with the employers in a better way, we will eliminate unemployment. That's the idea, at least, within this framework. Now, of course, in a framework like this, society, institutions, social norms, classes, power relations have absolutely no role. So you're not going to hear any of these things in a mainstream DSGE model, particularly. There is going to be no class in this model. There is going to be no power. In some models, they're imposed ad hoc on top, but in general, there's going to be no role for social norms or institutions or society, really. It's all going to start from the individual, and it's going to analyze the individual's behavior. And the idea is that without imperfections and frictions that exist in the markets, an unregulated market with flexible prices and perfectly informed individuals would give optimal outcomes, or Pareto optimal outcomes. This is the economics language. For those of you who are not familiar with this language, it just means Pareto efficient means the optimal outcome, actually. So the idea is that if there were no imperfections or no asymmetry of information or any of these, and markets were perfect, the outcome of a perfect market society is the optimal one. And actually, for this reason, this belief constitutes the central reference point for economic analysis and policy evaluation. So policymakers should strive to replicate the outcomes that would have prevailed under this optimal setting, actually. So that's what the policymakers should do. They should actually try to get results, get economic outcomes as close as possible to the perfect market case. That is the argument. And of course, in this methodology, there's a very strong insistence on equilibrium or equilibrating forces. There is an assumption that markets always move towards equilibrium. There is always markets clear in the end. Excess supply and excess demand are always eliminated in the market, and prices actually move up or down in order to eliminate the excess. So the idea is that economies always move to some sort of equilibrium. And that's exactly why it's called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. And for that reason, what these models simply do is to calculate one equilibrium, and then to give the economy a shock, calculate another equilibrium, actually, and then simply connect the two equilibriums through mathematical methods, really. That's what it's doing. And in this setup, the crises are always seen as the result of exogenous shocks rather than the outcome of endogenous forces. If you read the SGE models written after the crisis, you will find things like the crisis happened because there was a productivity shock. The crisis happened because there was a monetary shock, or there was a news shock, or there was some other shock. But the big problem here is that explaining the reason of the shock is not a problem, or it's not the task of the models. The models will never talk about why the shock happened. And that's not the task. The models simply analyze the economy without the shock and then with the shock. And then they connect the two, as I've said. That's all that's being done. And there's then the belief that economies will always converge to their inescapable long-run equilibrium values following these shocks. This is the idea of natural level of output, or more ironically, natural rate of unemployment. Now, this sounds slightly like religion to me, rather than science. Natural rate of unemployment means that this is the rate of unemployment that we cannot escape in the long run. We've got to have this unemployment. So, no central bank is actually trying to completely eliminate unemployment. Actually, in case you're not familiar with central bank policy, central banks do not try to get unemployment equal to 0. They try to get it equal to the natural level, which they think is correct. And then there is the insistence on formal analysis and a strictly instrumentalist approach to mathematical modeling, meaning that realisticness of assumptions does not matter. And this has been defended very strongly by all mainstream economists, that the only relevant criterion to measure the scientificness of a theory is its predictive power. If the model predicts well, it does not matter how unrealistic it is. When you criticize a mainstream model and say you can't set up a model with one individual in the economy, this is not realistic, the answer you get will be, we're not trying to be realistic anyway. No one's trying that. We know these models are wrong, actually. And I'm going to show this in a minute, actually. At the extreme, the famous Milton Friedman actually himself claimed that the more unrealistic a model's assumptions are, the better it is. These are his own words, actually. I've quoted. And again, a famous DSG modeler, a very recent quote, the models in economics are all wrong. Many people have emphasized that point. That's what makes economics different. These things are all invalid, but we work with wrong models because they're simple, and of course, because they're useful. Now, one can agree with the simple bit here, but the usefulness is open to discussion, unfortunately. And especially if you're applying this sort of methodology, if your models do not predict or are not useful, then they're worthless. Because they're wrong to start with. They're not realistic. They're not aspiring to be realistic. They get their use from being useful in prediction, which is the criteria that the mainstream put for itself. They've decided this criteria, that they're going to apply an instrumentalist approach, and they're not going to care about the realisticness of the assumptions, which means that the only value of the models actually comes from their use value or usefulness. If they cannot predict anything as well, this is just dogma. It's nothing else, actually. Again, I want to be fair to mainstream economists, simply because a lot of models will impose auxiliary realistic characteristics onto models, like sticky prices, sticky wages, or some other realistic imperfect markets, that markets are not going to work perfectly, markets are going to be imperfect. But these auxiliary realistic characteristics are at the end of the day imposed on top of a totally wrong foundation and a method. So then the question is, can you get good results by imposing these auxiliary realistic characteristics on top of a wrong foundation, actually? That's the defense that you will get. And the other problem is these realistic characteristics are imposed at random and at will, as they fit. So you're going to find one model which talks about sticky prices and perfect labor markets. You're going to find another model which has sticky wages but perfect information. You're going to find one other model which have both perfect information and both imperfect information and wage rigidity at the same time. So they're imposed as they fit. If you want to get something like fit your model to the previous data, you just try, actually, and see which one is going to fit to that previous data that you've got there. And one of them will fit. Believe me, that's what everyone does. Because as I've said, you just try with the model until it fits the data. You just change the assumptions and change it again and change it again. And at some point, they fit, at least roughly. But that does not really mean that they're going to fit in the future, simply because this is not the right way of doing science, unfortunately. Now, mainstream economists do not consider any other approach with a different methodology as economics. They're very serious about this. They claim that they're doing scientific economics, simply because it's mathematical. And anybody who is not using this methodology, individuals, single representative individual, representative firm, equilibrium, and all this, if you're not using this methodology, you're not doing scientific economics. They're not even going to listen to you, actually. You're going to send your papers to journals, they'll come back from the editor before going to the referees. They won't even go to the referees, your articles. They'll come back from the editor. I was going to say, this is not scientific economics, really, simply because it's not the same methodology. In other words, this is Paul Davidson's words, which I like quite a lot. In other words, mainstream economics insist on being precisely wrong, rather than being roughly right. actually. This is one of the main distinctions that I completely agree with when I compare mainstream and the heterodox, because most heterodox economists do not have the aspiration to be precisely correct anyway. They've got the aspiration to be at least roughly correct under some circumstances, whereas the mainstream insists on being precisely wrong rather than being roughly right under some circumstances. Now, of course, this dominance of mainstream economics is institutionally backed up, as I've just said, by journal ratings, which direct academic hiring decisions and allocation of research funds. All journals are ranked according to how mainstream they are. And the best journal, the best heterodox journal you can publish is Cambridge Journal of Economics, which is considered to be a 3-star journal. It is the only 3-star heterodox journal that exists. All other heterodox journals are 2-star, and then most mainstream technical mathematical journals are 3 and 4 stars, actually. So when you're getting employed, they ask you how many 3, 4-star publications have you got? And if you're doing heterodox economist, you might have maybe 1 if you have a Cambridge Journal of Economics paper, basically. And no other journal will have more stars than this. And therefore, it makes it, this actually simply reproduces itself, as you can see. Because universities will simply employ people working on mainstream economics continuously because of this. Simply because when it comes to the research evaluation exercise at the end of the year, particularly in the UK, what happens is that all those stars for a faculty are added up, actually. So you just add up the stars of the faculty. So every faculty is simply trying to maximize the stars that they're going to get at the end of the day. So for that reason, this dominance is entirely backed up by the journal ratings. And it also directs research grants as well. When you apply for a research grant, if you're not suggesting a research proposal in these lines, it's going to get rejected straight away, unfortunately. This is a very nice table from Mark Lavoie's recent book, 2014 book, where he actually talks about the distinction between mainstream and heterodox. I've already talked about a few of them. I'm not going to talk about all of these things simply because there's no time for that at the moment. But a few of them, most heterodox schools will actually, in terms of ontology or epistemology, most heterodox schools will insist on realism, whereas the mainstream or orthodox school will insist on instrumentalism, as I've just said. And in terms of method, most heterodox schools will be holistic or organicist, as it's called, and the mainstream or orthodox schools will be more individualist or atomistic. And in the political core, most heterodox schools, apart from the Austrians, of course, will be in favor of regulated markets, whereas the mainstream will be in favor of mostly in favor of unfettered markets. Really. This is kind of a rough distinction, but as I've said, it's quite difficult to draw this line between the two. That's why I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Now I'll talk briefly about the economics education and why the students are so unhappy about this. And as you can guess, the main reason is that economics education across the whole world is heavily dominated by mainstream economics. And keep in mind that although mainstream economics can indeed span a wide range of political views, you can actually write pretty leftist papers using mainstream methodology if you want. If you can get your assumptions right and the model right, it is possible to write these things. It's not impossible, really. Therefore, as Mark says as well, this is probably one of the reasons that some students who are inclined more to the left sometimes accept to work within the mainstream methodology, simply because it is flexible enough, actually. If you want, you can get pretty left-wing results. This is possible. It's not impossible, really. But the problem is the textbooks are heavily populated with neoliberal policy recommendations. I'm lecturing Macro 2 at the moment again. The very recent book, the latest new Keynesian book written by Niels Gottfries last year, actually. And again, these are the policy recommendations. If you want to reduce unemployment, reduce the wages. Fiscal policy is ineffective. There's no need to use it. Actually, fiscal policy is not going to work. Minimum wage regulations are bad. Labor unions are bad. Labor unions increase unemployment. Labor unions, minimum wages increase unemployment. And then there's the whole marginal productivity theory of wages and profits, assuming that workers get paid their marginal product or what they produce, in other words. So wages are determined like this. So we should aspire to make the wages equal to their marginal product, really. And even high financial sector salaries have been defended by some mainstream economists, arguing that their marginal product is really high. Now, that is extremely debatable if their marginal product is rather zero or, or infinitesimally low. But within the economics education, this is true for almost across the world. Once again, there's going to be no mention of alternative schools of thought, like post-Keynesians, Marxists, Austrians, feminists, institutionalists. I could just go on. And these are not niche areas. There are hundreds of economists working on this. These are dynamic theories that are being developed still. There are hundreds of economists working on these theories still. They're not some old, dead economists that said, they're not the ideas of some old economists that talked about these issues 100 years ago and that's it. These theories have been developed. And as I've said, there are loads of researchers working in these areas, but none of them will get any mention within the economics teaching at all. And most universities, including Manchester last year, they didn't have anyone to teach this module. They even removed the history of economic thought from their curriculums. So students don't even learn history of economic thought. They graduate without hearing the name Minsky or Keynes or Marx or Veblen or whoever you can think of. Like, they don't hear these names, and they get an economics degree without even hearing these names once during their degree. And that's one of the main reasons that the students have, of course, revolted. And I'm going to talk about actually the history of student movement, and this here I will give it a little bit of context and talk about why after the crisis the students revolted. But before that, as I've said, the history of student protest against economics teaching dates all the way back to 1970s. I'm not going to take it that far back. But I'll talk mainly about the post-statistic economics, the French student movement in 2000, who actually declared an online petition. And I've actually quoted this simply because it is still very valid. This is exactly what my students were saying last year, precisely. It's been 14 years since the French students declared this, saying that most of us have chosen to study economics to acquire a deep understanding of economic phenomena, but the teaching that's offered is, for the most part, neoclassical theory or approaches derived from it does not generally answer this expectation. This is what they were complaining about in 2000, and this is what students are still complaining about. It's been 14 years and nothing has changed, really. But this movement that started in 2000 gradually faded away, actually. And one of the main reasons, in my opinion, is the long boom years between 2002 and 2008, when the world economy was flourishing. So the dissenters were silenced, really, pretty easily as well. And during this period, mainstream economics declared its victory over economic policy. There's a very nice piece by Olivier Blanchard, written in 2010, where he actually confesses this and says, before the crisis, we thought we had solved all the problems of macroeconomics. That central banks would target inflation rates, there would be no controls on capital flows, capital would be allowed to move in and out, and there was no need for fiscal policy. These are the points that he uses to summarize the consensus before the crisis, actually. And this was also championed by international institutions and central banks. Ironically, central banks are now at the forefront of the protest against, some central banks at least, are now claiming that mainstream economics is not answering their needs. But back then, actually, before the crisis, they were among the ones that were championing all these ideas. And the critics were accused of being stuck in outdated theories and not grasping the new economic order, claiming that this time it's different. There's that famous paper as well, as most of you would know, by Reinhardt and Rogoff, that says this time it's different. But that was the argument before the crisis, that when you criticized all this, you were called a dinosaur, you were called a Marxist, a communist, you were accused of not understanding the new order, not understanding the new financial structure. And don't take my word for it, here is Alan Greenspan on this, the famous Fed chairman, who argued that the new financial products facilitate the dispersion of risk, and these increasingly complex financial instruments have contributed to the development of a far more flexible, efficient, and hence resilient financial system. Quite an unlucky statement to make, really, considering what came in 3 years after this statement. And this was the general mood among the mainstream economists before the crisis. And that's exactly why it was quite easy to contain the student movement, which started as the post-statistic economics back in the day. But then, when the crisis hit in 2008, this led to a complete turn of events, unfortunately, for the mainstream. Because first of all, there was no warning of a crisis, which actually threatened the integrity of the system itself. It was so big, the crisis, that people started questioning the integrity of capitalism, actually, itself. People started questioning the system, and there was no mention of it. No one had even warned about a forthcoming crisis. And of course, this is mainly because there is no debt relations in mainstream economics, because they mostly believe that debt is insignificant, so we shouldn't really investigate the amount of debt, because somebody's debt is somebody's savings. That's the argument. At the end of the day, if there is debt, that's somebody's savings. And Paul Krugman argued in favor of this last year, only on his blog. There was a massive discussion between Paul Krugman and Steve Keen about this particular topic, actually, that whether or not we should care about debt. And of course, you can read the discussion, because I don't want to talk more about that. But once again, one of the main reasons for the mainstream economists not being able to predict the crisis or to foresee what was coming is that there's no asset price bubbles or speculation in mainstream economics. These things don't exist within the models. And at least the main consensus was that central banks should not prick. This is Bernanke's paper, written, I think, in 2005, where he claimed that mainstream central bankers should not try to stop asset price bubbles unless they lead to an increase in expected inflation. That's what the argument was. And then the models are not really monetary economies. Money is just imposed onto the model. The models more like behave like barter economies. There is money in some models, but not in the real sense. But I'm not going to go into the details of this, because I'll have to talk a lot about the models themselves because of this. And of course, after the crisis, there was also public anger against excessively high financial sector salaries, as you know, bank bailouts, and cuts in social spending. And again, during the same period, popular social movements emerged as well, like Occupy Wall Street emerged at this time. And maybe what contributed most to the current student protest was the fact that there was a group of heterodox economists who had been warning of a very severe crisis since 2006, some of them even giving dates about the crisis. This is from the paper by Bezemer called "No One Saw This Coming," with a question mark, actually, summarizes all these predictions before the crisis, all these heterodox economists who were actually calling for a crisis pretty soon, as early as 2006. I just took some of them here: Dean Baker, Wynne Godley, Michael Hodson, Steve Keen, Scheller, and the famous Rubini. Surprisingly, it's only Dr. Rubini who got extremely famous among these people, but there were a lot of heterodox economists who were actually predicting a very serious financial crash coming as early as 2006. And again, after the crisis, some heterodox thinkers became very popular in the media. Again, even I think the Financial Times had a piece on Marx, actually, after the crisis, saying, "Is Marx back?" Something like that. And then Minsky got very popular. Hayek, once again, Austrian economics got really popular within this period. Hayek and Mises's ideas became popular during this period. And one should really see the revival of student movement within this context, because the students were being heavily exposed to all these through the media, and they were not, or the blogosphere, actually, because most of the recent discussions are being are actually on the blogosphere. People are discussing these things on their blogs. And students were reading these things, hearing about these thinkers, hearing about alternative explanations of the crisis, and then looking at their curriculum and not seeing any of it, actually. And then, as I've said, for this reason, the student movement should be considered within this context. And as I briefly mentioned, it started in France once again, with the PEP's economy in France in 2009. Then Rethinking Economics was set as a reading group at the University of Tübingen in 2010. And then the Rethinking Economics group collaborated with 14 other student societies in Germany and formed the Network for Plural Economics. And then in the US, a group of students walked out of the lecture of Gregory Mankiw. There's a very nice video about this as well, if any of you wants to watch it. They actually filmed the process as well. And the students walked out protesting that the macroeconomics module taught by Mankiw actually legitimizes the ultra-right-wing neoliberal policies. And they are fed up with listening to this stuff, and they do not want to listen to this stuff anymore. So then came the PostCrash Economic Society at the University of Manchester. I've briefly talked about this already in early 2013, just last year really. And their main idea was to campaign for a pluralist economics curriculum. And they demanded a more real-world oriented economics teaching and modules on heterodox economics. That's all they wanted. They did not try to destroy mainstream economics. They did not argue that they shouldn't learn mainstream economics. They just said, we want to learn something else as well with it. That's all they asked for, really. But of course, the mainstream economics got extremely defensive as a result of this. And they thought they're trying to completely abolish the mainstream. But that wasn't the purpose. This was what they were really asking for. And they organized public lectures on post-Keynesian, Marxist, Austrian, ecological, feminist, institutionalist economics, just like this. They brought people, like prominent names from these schools of thought, to give public lectures, particularly about the crisis and about the general framework of these schools of thought. They wrote a comprehensive critical report on the economics curriculum at the University of Manchester, which is very impressive if you think that they're only undergraduates, really. It's a 45-page report that analyzes each module one by one, almost, in the economics department at Manchester, pointing out the deficiencies within the modules and suggesting improvements during this. And then, as I've said before, we organized with them together a non-credit evening lectures on heterodox economics and history of financial crisis. I proposed this module twice. It was rejected twice, which made me extremely angry, actually. And then we decided with the PostCrash Economic Society that we will run this module after 5 o'clock. No credits, no exams, nothing, just to learn, actually. And they were quite keen on this, and then we organized this, and they've been impressively successful in popularizing the discussion in the teaching of economics. They got excessive media coverage in The Guardian, Independent, The Economist, Wall Street, New York Times, everywhere. And their success led to the emergence of similar societies in the UK. As far as I know, there are about 12 or 13 similar societies in Manchester at the moment, at LSE, Cambridge, Oxford, Warwick. These are the ones I can remember, actually. And it also led to a global organization of autonomous student societies all over the world. Now the students have organized International Student Initiative for Pluralism in Economics. And as you can see, this is a collaboration of 65 associations from over 30 countries over the world. And this website has not been updated for a while. At the moment, they've got about over 40 countries, as far as I know, and very close to 90 associations. That's the latest news I got from my students, actually. And then the Rethinking Economics Conference series, which was initially organized at the University of Tübingen, evolved into a global network of students, academics, and civil society groups. And they organized 2 large conferences in London and New York in September 2014. And again, last week, we launched the Rethinking Economics group at Kingston University with a public lecture by Professor Steve Keen. Now, mainstream response, I'll talk very briefly about this. Initially, there were promising developments in the UK. It looked like the mainstream economists would listen at least in the beginning, as I've said. First, there was a discussion group that was formed after a Bank of England conference. There was a Bank of England conference in 2012 entitled "Are Economics Graduates Fit for the Purpose?" And after this conference, there was a discussion group formed, which mainly consisted of mainstream economists. And the group agreed that students should be given a higher awareness of economic history and limitations of mainstream economics methodology. This is straight from their report, actually. And the report agreed that there is need for a greater degree of pluralism and that we must confront all theoretical frameworks with empirical evidence. This is the report. This is what the report said. But then, ironically, they asserted the superiority of mainstream economics over heterodox alternatives afterwards, exactly with their words. Again, here is what they said: pluralism should not be confused with the heterodox approach. One really wonders how you can be pluralist without teaching anything heterodox. I mean, there's a problem here with the meaning of the word, I guess, because how can you be pluralist if you're not going to teach anything heterodox? Really, I don't get this definition of pluralism, I'll be honest with you. But they seem to be thinking like this. And they argued that the deficiencies in economics teaching is because mainstream economics did not incorporate the latest developments in their research into the curriculum. Or in other words, they argued that, look, we're teaching these, but this is not what we are saying in our own models. So we should update the mainstream. If we update the mainstream, it's all going to be fine, actually. That's the reason they're revolting, because we're teaching them the old theories. We're not doing these things anymore. That was the argument, actually. That's what the report says very explicitly. And as a result, they got INET funding, £1 million, actually, from INET, to come up with this project called Curriculum Open Access Resources in Economics, the CORE project, which is supposed to design new curriculum tools for economics students. Yeah? This is the first serious institutional attempt. It's financed by INET, and it's led by Wendy Carling of University College London. But what they did, they published their first textbook. It's online. If any of you is interested, you can just open an account and view the textbook that they published. It is simply a representation of mainstream economics, blended with some history, and as I've said, some recent favorable data, selective data, which fits to some of the things. But what is even funnier is that there's no mention of any heterodox ideas inside, apart from a few funny boxes, really, on Marx, Hayek, Coase, and all this. When you start reading this book, what you see is it's talking about marginal costs, marginal profits, and all this. Just in the middle of this, there's a little box talking about Marx. And that's it, really. And now you read it 20 pages, again, microeconomics, mainstream microeconomics, and there, another box talking about Hayek, really. Just a little box. That's, I think, their understanding of pluralism. That's as pluralist as it gets, if you like. You get it in a small box, really. Like a historical figure. Like there are no Marxists working on this, on Marxism anymore. Or there are no Austrians, or Austrian theories as Hayek wrote it, and no other developments have happened since Hayek wrote Austrian theory. Or these are just some historical figures that you're going to mention there, and these schools of thought are dead and they're not alive. And again, as I've said, this is complete ignorance of developments in heterodox economics. But the university departments remain resistant to change. Nothing has changed in Manchester, apart from one module, which I designed with another lecturer last year for some first-year economics students, which has some heterodoxy, but it's offered outside the economics department, of course. It is not within the economics department, because the economics department did not accept it within the department. Said you can teach it, but some other place, like teach it outside here, not here, really. So there is that module, but apart from that, most university departments remain completely resistant. And mainstream economics, the economists defend their academic and pedagogical hegemony, despite all this counter evidence that there is against their theories. Here is Coyle again. The basic building blocks of the subject remain solid. This is the argument. But I'm going to skip this now because I don't have time. I would like to talk about this, but I'm going to talk about, I'm finishing. I'm going to talk about just one more point. This time, though, the student protests found some unexpected support from the central bankers. I'll quote three people, Bank of England's Andy Haldane, who argued that it is time to rethink the basic building blocks of economics. And only last week, Central Bank of England, Andy Haldane himself, last week announced that Bank of England is going to publish heterodox research. They've said we will publish heterodox research. And the main reason for this is that the mainstream economics is completely useless for the central bankers. And they cannot really afford failing and failing all the time. So they've turned their attention to heterodox thinkers, and they've started looking at the heterodox literature now for this reason. Again, another one, Claudio Borio from the Bank for International Settlements. Business cycles should be understood as the result of endogenous forces that perpetuate irregular cycles. This will require us to move away from the heavy focus on equilibrium concepts and analyze business fluctuations and the merits of disequilibrium analysis, really. Again, Bank for International Settlements is the central bank of the central banks, if it's not familiar for any of you. And again, ex-Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee member William Buter, most academic and monetary economics since 1970s is intellectual sunk capital, motivated by internal consistency and mathematical elegance rather than a genuine desire to grasp the working of an economy. These are ex-central bankers, as I've said. Andy Haldane is still a central banker. He's the chief economist at Central Bank of England, actually. And Borio is still a very prominent economist at the Bank for International Settlements. Those of you familiar with this literature will know all these names anyway. A brief assessment, 1 minute, and I'll stop. In my opinion, the students have actually achieved something impressive by managing to popularize the discussion on economics education. And they've been very successful in organizing autonomous groups this time. So they've got some global networks this time, unlike the previous cases. But the movement has not yet managed to convince the university departments or managements for a meaningful reform. This has not happened yet, so this is something that should happen in the future. And the popular movements like Occupy and the student movement actually feed from similar social dynamics. That's exactly why I talked about the context within which the economic student resistance revived once again. But unlike Occupy, the student movement could actually organize around a set of common goals, despite political disparities among its members. Every time I talk about this subject, some people are very eager to say, oh, these are just a bunch of communists. That's it. And that is not true. That is nowhere near the truth. The student groups are a very diverse group. You've got Austrians inside, which are the ultra right-wing, if you like. It's as right as it gets, really. And now you've got them, you do have Marxists inside, and now you have some students who genuinely want a good economics education. They're not really partisans or anything. This is not true. They come from a very diverse background, some of them. I would say for my own students that I can speak very comfortably, a few of them are, yes, Marxist, but a wide majority of them are not, nowhere near. At most, you can call them as progressives, maybe, but that's it. That's as far as radical as it gets in terms of the political spectrum, if you like. But what happened was that the student movement invigorated heterodox economists, but the main lesson that we should all get is that, as heterodox economists, is at least that we should maintain, support, and develop a new set of teaching tools. I've personally applied for a new INET grant for this, hopefully. If we manage to get the grant, we're going to write a new textbook, fingers crossed. But the student groups should not really forget the relationship between the dominance of mainstream economics and the neoliberal political and social agenda, because at the end of the day, these two are linked. Whenever you say this, you get called a conspiracy theorist. Straight away, they'll call you a conspiracy theorist. They'll say, oh, you're just making up things. But there is a very strong relationship between the two, simply because this economics has been used to justify right-wing policies all the time in the last 25 years. So for this reason, they should really seek alliance with broader social groups, such as trade unions, to increase the possibility of success. So that when you have people like this, like the Koch brothers, who donated $1.5 million to Florida University, but they want ultra right-wing economics faculty in exchange, really. So this is the latest news from The Guardian, actually. So all this also has, all this movement inescapably has got a political side to it as well. It's inescapable, that political side, unfortunately. And that's how I'm going to finish my talk. I'm sorry I went over time for a few minutes. Thank you very much. Good.
Thank you very much. You were actually just a few minutes
Sorry about
late
that.
because we started late. So very good. I would have here speaking even more, but now we have 2 comments, and then we have to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. So first, Lauri, please.
Yeah, thanks. So usually I use these kinds of opportunities to offer some kind of a post-Keynesian critique of mainstream macroeconomic thought. But this time I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to focus on the question that Devrim maybe a bit dealt with in his presentation, but not that much, namely the question that why has heterodox economics then remained in the margins, and why then economics hasn't really changed. I think there are basically 2 possible explanatory models to analyze this. The first, there's the opportunity to see this, or the possibility to see this from the perspective of the orthodoxy. Many orthodox thinkers usually highlight that the heterodox remains marginalized because it has basically lost the open academic debate in the academia. That is the fate of every perspective that really loses academic debates. That the orthodoxy really has better arguments. That's the kind of a usual thing that I'm hearing, for example, in Finland usually. That if you really have better arguments, then you have also more visibility, you have more power, and so on and so forth. All is only about the level of arguments, the standard of arguments within academia. Okay, that's one explanatory model. Then the alternative explanation would focus on things that relate to sociology of knowledge and sociology of science. And I believe that these kinds of explanations are more realistic than in order to understand why heterodox economics remains in the margins than this orthodox way of explaining it. So basically, why then the first explanation is so completely wrong as I think it is? Well, when we think about or look about the history of economics or the history of economic thought, we can basically see that there has been only one big debate between heterodox and orthodox schools that has taken place within the academia, I mean within academic publications. Of course, there have been many debates after that, like the ones which were where Steve Keen was fighting Paul Krugman and so on and so forth, but these have been like extra academic in the sense that they have taken place in blogosphere and so on and so forth. But the one debate which we have had was the capital debates of the 1960s, or the capital controversies, as it has usually been called. And the funny thing is that actually that in some ways that debate sealed the fate of heterodox economics. And heterodox economics didn't actually get marginalized because they lost the debate. They got marginalized because they won the debate, and that was yeah, well. Okay, well that is this kind of a usual level of argumentation that the heterodox economists used to get, but when we are dealing with that, if we are thinking about that debate, I'm not going too deep on that debate because that's not the issue here. But the central issue of the debate was that whether there exists an inverse relationship between capital intensity and capital remuneration. And if not, then of course the level of investment is not, of course, dependent on the interest rate, and then of course the whole idea of natural rate of interest also collapses, and then at the same time, of course, all the natural rates disappear: the natural rate of unemployment, the natural rate of growth, and so on and so forth. And then you don't anymore have the self-equilibrating mechanisms and no long-run equilibrium points, and so on and so forth. So the thing is that we don't even have to debate which parts actually won the debate, because that was actually conceded by the proponents of the orthodox side, that they lost the debate. There is a Paul Samuelson paper from 1966 where Paul Samuelson is actually saying explicitly that the heterodox won the debate. So we don't actually have to even discuss this whole thing. What Samuelson said in 1966 was that basically the heterodox camp was right in their criticisms, and he had run out of arguments, and he was the leading proponent of the orthodox side in that debate. But what Samuelson also said was that even though that the heterodox side was theoretically right, we should not still start to appreciate the heterodox methodology or the heterodox criticisms on so on and so forth. So the idea was that what Samuelson and his followers were basically saying is that we need these kinds of assumptions of natural rates of interest or any other natural rates in order to make manageable models, and in order to basically have that kind of a set of methodology that we have used to have. So okay, so basically the thing was that they admitted losing in a theoretical sense, but then they were saying that basically the kinds of methodological consequences are too heavy. So of this defeat. So basically we don't have to appreciate these views or take them into account or anything like that. So what was the consequence of that debate was that basically we used to have economists that were the kinds of real stars of the whole discipline. People like Joan Robinson, for example, Luigi Pasinetti, Piero Sraffa, and so on and so forth. These were basically very, very famous economists who published in all the biggest mainstream journals, still in 1950s, 1960s, and in the beginning of the 1970s. But after the capital debates, these people were not actually anymore, they didn't have the possibilities that they used to have to publish in these papers, and their followers did not have these possibilities anymore also. There's a good quote from Sidney Weintraub, a leading post-Keynesian from the United States, who used to always highlight that he is an extraordinary economist in the sense that he has published in all the biggest economics journals, but Weintraub, who had maybe the most impressive publication list in the sense of the scope of journals where he has published in the 1960s, was basically prevented from publishing in these journals anymore in the beginning of 1970s, because the response from the orthodoxy started to be that okay. You might be saying something where you might have some point or not, we don't know, but what you are clearly doing is something different. You are not doing the thing that we are doing here. So you should find some other forums where you could publish and do your stuff. And that was actually the real reason why there was found the Cambridge Journal of Economics and the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics and other heterodox heterodox journals, because the heterodoxy did not actually want to escape the whole discipline of economics, but they were forced to do that. And they were not forced to do that because they lost any debate. There has not been a single academic debate where in the history of economics which would have ended up in the heterodox losing the debate. But there has been one debate where Paul Samuelson has explicitly conceded a defeat in that debate. Okay, so then the question is that then there must be some extra academic factors that maintain the hegemonic position of neoclassical mainstream economics. And of course, I seem to have 1 minute, and if I go 1 minute past that, then I have 2 left. So I'll try to be as quick as possible. I think part of these extra academic factors were already covered by Devrim in his speech, in the sense that that basically young economists are not anymore exposed to other schools of thought, or they are not exposed to basically to the history of economic thought. For example, in the University of Helsinki, they have completely dropped out the history of economic thought from the curriculum, and that has been dropped out already many years ago. Actually, when I was studying, there still used to be that, and the course actually, basically the only source of the whole course was Wikipedia. I still think that was actually one of the best courses that I had there. But that describes also the, well, okay, I don't say anymore. But the fact is that most of the young economists think that there is only one economics. They are not even aware of the fact that there are different schools of thought. And also they are not aware of the history of economic thought. They don't know about capital debates. They don't know about other forms of heterodox criticisms and so on and so forth. So they basically have this kind of an idea that we have this kind of our own discipline, and the only debates that there are the debates that have taken place within this discipline. Okay. That was the first factor, and then I'll end up with the another factor that I think is the most crucial when we are trying to explain why economics really hasn't changed. And I think that has something to do with the mechanisms of how paradigmatic changes occur in different academic disciplines. So, and the normal Kuhnian idea of paradigmatic change is centered around the concept of anomalies. And with anomalies, Kuhn means basically these kinds of spots or areas in any academic discipline which the current hegemonic paradigm cannot really explain. And in a very particular social setting or in a social situation, these kinds of anomalies, some set of anomalies can become too burdensome or too indefensible, so that the whole paradigm collapses, and there happens the whole collapse of the theoretical edifice. But I think the problem with mainstream economics is that basically the anomalies of mainstream economics are not burdens for that theory. They are actually beneficial for that theory. In a sense that if we think, for example, some obvious anomalies of neoclassical economics, for example, the idea of the neutrality of money in the long run, or the Say's law that the aggregate demand has no role in the long run, I think these are obvious anomalies in the sense that if we have fundamental uncertainty, if we have endogenous money and so on and so forth, these cannot hold up. But still still they are, economists are clinging on to these axioms. And why they are clinging on to these axioms is that basically you can draw conclusions, the policy conclusions that you can draw from these grounds are that basically you need to increase labor supply in order to spur growth in the long run. And for example, in Finland now everyone is speaking in the middle of a very strong recession. Everyone is only speaking about increasing the labor supply, which means decreasing basically the wage rate. So we know that we have a lot of powerful social groups that are pro wage restraint. So basically, if you have theories that are saying that we need wage restraint, then it's quite obvious that it gets a lot of support, for example, from the business elites and so on and so forth, even though these views would be basically the anomalies of that particular theory. So I think these two factors are the real explanations for the question that why economics hasn't really changed. Thanks.